as I say, a surfeit of riches, so many things that could be said. And but I don't want to take too long because we're gathering around the table. We come to break bread together. But a few thoughts. So let me begin with a saying that we hear often. The sky's the limit. I don't know if you use it, but I'm sure you've heard it. The sky's the limit, they say. And I think they mean when they say the sky's the limit, in effect, that there are no limits, that you can achieve anything if you really want to. The sky's the limit. And it strikes me that the gospel of Jesus Christ tends, at least in some way, to support such an attitude to life. For the gospel breaks down barriers and limits. The gospel sets us free from sin and death, making possible what was impossible. According to Galatians chapter 1, for example, Jesus gave himself for our sins to set us free from the present evil age. Can't get much freer than that, can you? Or as Jesus puts it in Mark chapter 10, for God, all things are possible. Yet today's Bible readings, I think anyway, invite us to consider another side of that story. For they feature not the removing of limits, but the imposition of limits by God. Take, for example, the Call of Ezekiel. You might imagine that God would say to Ezekiel, and to any prophet, I suppose, prophesy to the people, and I will work through your words so that the people respond favorably. Go prophesy, and nothing will be impossible to you. That's what God should say to Ezekiel, isn't it? But God says nothing of the sort. God sends Ezekiel to a stubborn people and warns Ezekiel that they may not respond as well as he would have hoped. But whether they hear or refuse to hear, they shall know that there has been a prophet among them. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that that's a pretty limited outcome for a call that is itself set about by limits. Ezekiel then takes up the mantle, knowing that the success or otherwise of his ministry would depend, at least to some degree, upon the response of generally unresponsive people. And even Jesus faced similar kinds of limitations to those of Ezekiel. For prophets, said Jesus, are not without honor, except in their hometown. And where was Jesus ministering? Yeah, his hometown. And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. Well, St. Paul was given a thorn in the flesh, whatever you might take that to mean. Paul given a thorn in the flesh. And the disciples were sent out with no bread, no bag, no money. In all these instances, the servants of God were beset by God-given limitations. Of course, we all face limitations in life. None of us have limitless strength or wealth. None are omnicompetent. All of us must face some kind of suffering and death. Life in this world comes with limits, whether we like it or not. Super apostles can be entirely and completely obnoxious. For our Bible readings tell us, I think, that some limits, and some limits, not all, but some limits, can be good for us. Super apostles without limit seem not to be quite so good for the church as those like Paul who are aware of their weaknesses. Indeed, Jesus imposed limits on his disciples, and God gave to Paul a thorn in the flesh for a purpose. Why do you think it was that Jesus sent the disciples out without bag, without money? Well, the disciples would have to rely on the hospitality of others. I suppose in a sense they'd rely on each other, sent out in twos. That might be a limit too. Sent out not in a great big group where you can hide, but 2 by 2. They'd help each other, I suppose, but also they would have to rely on the help of those to whom they were sent, even if those to whom they were sent were not all that responsive to the gospel. The disciples would have to rely on the hospitality of others and would have to suffer the indignity of asking for help. Paul, in his circumstances, would learn a little humility, although in this passage it's difficult to decide whether he's in humble or boastful mode, and he tends to switch from one to the other. But in the end, he boasts not in his powers, but in his weaknesses. Paul would learn a little humility. He would be kept from being too elated, and he would discover God's strength in Paul's own weaknesses. Whenever I am weak, he says, then I am strong. You know, many of us find it much easier to care for the needs of others than to receive the help of others ourselves. We sing, don't we? Brother, sister, let me serve you. Let me be as Christ to you. Pray that I may have the grace to let you be my servant too. It's many years now since George W. Webber, Bill Webber, taught us that Christians are not lifeguards, safe and dry on the side of the water, throwing out flotation devices. No, we are also swept by the flooding currents of life, says Webber, and in need of rescue by Christ as much as anyone else in danger of drowning. So I wonder about your limitations and mine. Could God be in whatever limitations we are currently facing in our lives? I don't know about you, but I feel quite tired of the limitations to our church's life and mission brought about by coronavirus restrictions. I hope that they will soon be lifted. But I wonder whether we have been learning from the limitations. And I wonder if we will emerge having grown through the experience. I wonder too whether sometimes we might be fighting the wrong battles. We strive to rid ourselves of the very limits God has imposed. Or, on the other hand, we might accept as limitations the weaknesses that God is calling us to overcome. I find that often I have to resort to that wonderful, if now hackneyed prayer of Reinhold Niebuhr. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. So let us bring our weaknesses our limitations, our very selves to the table of the Lord. Let us seek God's wisdom, God's grace, God's healing and help, that we might serve the Lord in our weaknesses, as well as in spite of them.